great to have you here in our courtyard whenever you're watching this. And I have a new mask that Max and his family made. It's very UCC and the right UCC colors, so thank you, Max, for this mask. And I think some of you may know Max McHugh, a member of our congregation, has a lovely wife, Susan, and two wonderful blonde-haired girls. Great family. And so we're really happy to have Max here. Max actually, in his day life, works at the Vets Hospital in the sleep program. And so I have some questions for Max. As I've gotten to know Max, one thing I didn't know about Max, he actually had come in one day to do some welding here at the church and found out that he had grown up on the Lakota reservation in South Dakota, Pine Ridge, the notorious Pine Ridge reservation. And that fascinated me, having spent some time on the Pine Ridge reservation. And I think Max might have recognized that from one of my messages. But of course, my time is kind of like, it doesn't even matter how much time you spend there. As somebody who did not grow up there, and you always feel like a guest or a visitor, right? You don't have an opportunity to really dig your heels in. And so Max shared quite a bit with me because he grew up there. And I'd just like to ask Max, because I think this is one of those things that we really haven't addressed very much, especially around COVID and around the world in which we're living right now, is the indigenous population. And we know right now up on the reservation, the Navajo reservation, that the COVID rates are quite a bit higher. Also in Flagstaff, as Max shared. But I really want to ask Max what it was like to grow up on a reservation, especially the Pine Ridge Reservation, and how that's informed his worldview and his viewpoint in the world.
You know, I was born there, so it's what I knew. Honestly, adapting to white people life, or what we would call Washichu life, was the real switch.
Have you got that figured out yet?
No, I haven't figured out yet, and I'm over 50, and I'm still trying to figure it out. But yeah, it wasn't until I moved away, I joined the Army and moved away, that I realized what the rest of the world did. Actually, I was 11 and my mom left the reservation. I was 6th grade and we left the reservation, and she wanted to finish her degree down at this fundamentalist school in South Florida. And I was terrified to leave. I didn't want to be around Washichus, white people. I was one of the only white kids in my school, and I had never heard, all I had heard about white people was how cold they were and how materialistic they were. And I was raised with stories of, because I was in Pine Ridge during the Wounded Knee occupation in 1974, and our house was taken over by teenagers from the Blackfoot tribe and whatever they came down there. And you know, and on the reservation, when you're a missionary brat, there's no hotels on the reservation. So when people come from elsewhere, they stay with family, and if they don't stay with family, it's just kind of customary that strangers will go to the nearest church, and they can come at any time of the night, and it's just kind of understood that that's where they're going to be sleeping for the night. So they'll bring a sleeping bag, blankets, what have you, and they'll sack out on the pews, they'll do what have you. And so that's what happened with us. And so, yeah, that was my norm. And yeah, it was strange. And
yeah, the summers I spent there, I spent one month with a family in their trailer, a family that I had gotten to know, and they trusted me because I was there to work primarily with the youth, and also they have a Lakota University there, or high school, that prepares the students, right? Yeah. Because the education they get is really not enough, at least what I was told, for them to succeed in a traditional college. And so they have a college prep, right? Lakota University, I think they call it, right? And there's such a high suicide rate among many of the youth there that I was there to do some work, and this is way back when I was doing HIV/AIDS prevention, also working with queer identified youth, and doing suicide prevention and domestic violence. Right. And so those were all issues kind of wrapped up in my summer there. And I remember that, yeah, the hospitality was amazing, And the understanding that most, like you said, white people are cold.
Right.
That we're cold emotionally, that we're just cold people.
Yeah, and it's just...
And somewhat heartless.
Yeah, and this whole idea, and I don't know where the stereotype came from of the stoic Indian, you know, the wooden Indian. That was never my experience growing up. I mean, you want to talk about gallows humor. Most of the Lakota folks I knew grow up just have this twisted, dry sense of humor. Yeah. And it's very similar to what you would see in a lot of healthcare workers, a lot of soldiers, where, you know, when your world is a wreck, your coping strategy is your sense of humor.
Right. Oh yeah.
And
that's my coping strategy.
And I'm trying to avoid profanity in this because, you know, I work at the VA and you know, we throw F-bombs every other word, and that's just normal.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's just kind of, it's very similar, you know, and it's interesting too, where I joined the Army at 17 to get off the reservation. It was the only thing I had. I was a smart kid, but I didn't know anything about applying for scholarships or anything like that. And I took a route a lot of the Lakota kids do. They join the Army, they join the Navy, just as a way to get out.
That's kind of the way my family is in Mississippi too.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm wearing the Mississippi Ole Miss hat today because of the tornadoes in my home state. But it's the same thing, you know, my nephew, my niece, several of my family members, they all go off to the military. They see it as their way out. They don't really know any other way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny, growing up, we would always have like powwows, which, and there were always the veterans organizations at the powwows. You know, you would always have the songs, the dances for the vets and the powwows and everything. And growing up, it was vets of the Vietnam War primarily. But even now, it's, you have Gulf War vets and everything, and it's still, there's this, that warrior ethos is still very much alive on the reservation, partially because it's the only way out.
So, Max, I want to ask you a bit about your experience as a child of a missionary, and you just shared with me during our break that it was kind of the family business, being a missionary, being a missionary's kid, and what that was like to be a missionary, to be the son of a missionary on the reservation, and how that kind of fed or maybe didn't feed your soul. And you were Wesleyan Methodist, which is a rather conservative.
Right. We weren't born again. We were born like 5 or 6 times and sanctified and
just
all
5 or
that.
6?
Yeah. It's funny. I think I embraced it at a very young age, but it didn't take me too long to abandon it. I felt like, well, first of all, when you're a missionary brat, you have to sing for your supper, and many times literally sing for your supper. So yeah, we were the trained monkeys. We were the ones that your parents would parade you out, and you would have to sing. You would have to help out in the daily vacation Bible school, and
that's why you have such a good singing voice.
I didn't have a choice. Yeah, it was that or don't eat. Yeah, and we would go on what we call deputation trips, where because you'd have to. It wasn't Wesleyan. Churches weren't so much like other more established denominations where you get a salary. You might get a little bit of a stipend, but most of the money you make is what you can drum up when you go and do these trips around the country to try to drum up business. And so we would have our shtick. We would go out and we would have to sing. We would have to do slideshows. We would have to do all this stuff. And Yeah, it was strange. And some of my first experiences with white people was on my deputation trip. And some of the questions I got from white kids about living on the reservation were really
Do
strange.
you remember some of those questions?
Well, yeah, I mean, things about do they still live in teepees, and do they
Still scalp white people?
Yeah, it was like, yeah, it was so bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how little sometimes we really know about other cultures, or how we learn about other cultures from media, from television, from places that certainly aren't historically accurate or
Right.
accurate, period, right? I remember as a kid playing cowboys and Indians, right? And it was always scalping,
Mm-hmm.
the cowboys. It was just, it was preposterous. Yeah.
And it's we played cowboys and Indians too. And what was so bizarre is being raised on the reservation, even the Lakota kids, nobody wanted to be the Indian.
Right.
Because they were seen as being less than. They were seen as being the victim. Even the Lakota wanted to be the cowboy.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So
Yeah.
you said that you said that you eventually kind of moved away from that faith, that more conservative, manipulative faith. What moved you to that, or how
It
did
didn't
you...
take too long because, first of all, I was a very smart kid growing up, and I think you and I have talked a little bit about the role of the heoka, the clown in Lakota culture, and how the role they play is kind of a social commentarian. And the irony is, the clown is always they're the perennial outsider. They're in the culture, but they're not really in the culture. And it's interesting in Lakota culture too that the heoka were typically also winkte, which winkte were typically homosexual. And partially, and it's only with benefit of hindsight as I've grown up that I really understood that, because when I was a kid, I was immersed in it. I didn't have the perspective of really seeing it. But I knew some winktes, and they did not fit the mold, but yet they were also the ones who were the most likely to comment on some of the idiosyncrasies of the society and things that were just plain wrong in the society, both white society and Lakota society. And
did they identify as a heoka? Did they identify, say, this is my role, or was that...
That wasn't until it came later. I mean, there was this purging of Lakota culture that came largely due to Christian missionaries come in,
Yeah.
They came into the reservation right around the turn of the century, and in order to be a Christian, you had to renounce what made you Lakota. They would have to cut their hair, they had to give up their language, they had to give up a lot of their culture. And it wasn't until the 1970s when kind of the Jesus movement started and some of the liberation theology started in the cities, and then sort of the black liberation came. And it moved into the reservation right around the early 1970s that you started to see a resurgence of Lakota culture. And the problem is the teens who were picking up Lakota culture weren't getting a lot of mentoring from their parents and their grandparents, because their parents and grandparents had it beat out of them by Christian missionaries and by what have you. And so they're creating it. So there's like a very real generation gap where there's this separation. And so, so some of the things we think we know about the heoka and the winkte and everything, we're guessing at, And so I saw people who would be considered heoka would be considered winkte, but it isn't until you get people trying to recreate their culture that's been largely decimated that they are actually kind of figuring it out. And I was not winkte in the sense of being homosexual, but I was winkte in that I was an outsider in the culture, because in a culture where teen boys were expected to be good basketball players and fast runners and what have you, here I was a nerdy, bookish boy who was very smart, and that made me an outsider in the culture. And so that kind of made me a de facto winkte or heoka.
So the emphasis on sports with teenage boys, was that something that was kind of through the missionaries, or was that...
No.
I mean, culture?
Jim Thorpe. I don't know if you remember Jim Thorpe. He was the famous decathlete. He was Lakota.
Oh, yes.
And the high school that I went to in Pine Ridge was the Thorpe and so...
Oh, you went to Thorpe?
Yeah, and that was seen as a way out. Sports was a way out.
Kind of like sports is a way out, probably in many black families.
Right.
Black culture.
Very much. And it's interesting now, looking back, you see that so many of the things that happen in black culture, there's a lag where things that are embraced in black culture end up being embraced in Lakota culture like 10 to 15 years later.
Wow. So liberation theology
Yeah.
came into the
There's
Lakota
this lag.
culture.
There's this significant lag.
Huh.
And if you think about it, it starts in the urban areas, it starts in the
Yeah,
cities, and it
right.
takes a little while to
Right.
filter down to the reservation. We used to joke that we got Saturday Night Live on Sunday morning.
That's great. That's great. Wow. So how did you find did you go through a period where you would have considered yourself non-religious or
Oh, yeah,
non-spiritual?
yeah. I mean,
because of what you experienced?
yeah.
And did that put you at odds with the family?
Yeah, I got forced to go. When my mom got her degree, I was a freshman in high school, and it was in Hope Sound Bible College in Florida. And then for the next 2 years, I stayed in the dorms there. I was a, what do they call it?
Resident director?
No, I was a boarding school student. They had a
Oh,
boarding school,
okay.
so I stayed there for 2 more years. But I had effectively thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So here I am, effectively an agnostic kid, being raised in the belly of the beast.
Wow.
And so yeah, starting probably around 11 or 12, I would have considered myself agnostic. Yeah.
So questioning whether there's a God or not.
Yeah,
Or
and certainly
did it
whether
really
the Christian
matter?
of God, the Christian God,
Christian
or
God.
the very narrow perception of God that I was raised with. You know, it made no sense to me, especially being raised with Lakota culture, where they've got the Wakantanka, you know, the Great Spirit God concept, where God is in the air you breathe, God is in everything, you know. You, I, the dirt. In Lakota culture, humans are no more important than a chipmunk or a squirrel or what have you. We're all just part of the godness that is
The web of life.
yeah, and so this whole hierarchy of being that you get with the Christian thing just made no sense to me.
Where humans or women are the ones to have dominion and power and authority over the animals and the beasts and the birds.
Right.
And creation, and in an abusive
Right.
dominion, dominating
Right.
way.
Yeah, and so I'm raised as a missionary brat, but yet what
Yeah.
I'm seeing all around me is Lakota religion and Lakota culture, and to be honest, it made more sense to me. And the more I learned about science, because I always wanted to go into medicine, the more I learned about science, the less the Christianity I was raised with made any sense to me whatsoever. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think in many ways, I would say that I started to study liberation theology, process theology, and then I think spending time on the Lakota reservation and reading books about indigenous spirituality really, I think, drew me back to what I think the Christian faith is completely lost.
Right.
That God is in all things, you know, and we are in God, and God is in us, and God is in the brick, right? The metal, the trees, the birds, the pigeons that we abhor around here, right? So God is in all of those things, and a part of them, a part of us, and interconnected. And I think, you know, it was interesting because when I spent some time on the reservation, and you obviously know this too, is that in their hunting rituals, they would thank Spirit for the animal, and then thank the animal for giving its life for them to feed them.
Of course.
And it was beauty, right? There was beauty in that, and that is not how I was raised in Mississippi. I mean, I was the same. I was the bookish kid like you were, right? I was supposed to learn to hunt and fish. Didn't do well with that. But, you know, when I saw my family hunting and fishing, it was always that dominion. Kill that animal, you know, take that animal. It's ours. We possess it. And there was never any gratitude or thanksgiving. And what I experienced on the Lakota reservation and with indigenous people is just beautiful.
Right.
And I'm assuming part of that is also reconnecting to that culture, right? Because if they've lost that, they've also had to reconnect.
Right. Yeah, you know, and it's interesting. My dad was murdered when I was 6, and my mom was raising 3 kids, more or less alone on the reservation. But that whole extended family concept you have on the reservation, our concept of relative, of family is different, because there were people that I called aunt and uncle who were obviously not my aunt and uncle, but I had father figures growing up who were Lakota, and so when my dad died, it wasn't so much that I had lost a dad. Well, I lost a dad, but I gained a bunch of uncles, who helped raise me. And they were the ones who taught me how to hunt. They were the ones that taught me how to fish. They did all of that stuff. And yeah, it was just kind of strange. And so I didn't have steak growing up, but we would have people bring us a side of venison. And they would drop it off at my mom because she's a widow raising kids. And so they didn't have money, but somebody killed a deer and would bring part of it in, and and
So after your father was killed,
yeah.
Can you talk about that at all, or is there, and why did your mom stay on the reservation? What was the?
It was what she knew.
Was what she was comfortable with?
Yeah, and I think
Was
after
community,
a while,
family?
Yeah, it was a sense of family. I mean, she kind of pushed away from the materialism in white culture too. I mean, she had lived there since the 60s, and my mom, as conservative as she is also very hippie, in that sense. And so I think that she just found, as depressing as it was sometimes, that she just found Lakota culture more at home, more of a home for her. And there were people there that knew my father, and my father had made quite an impact on the reservation. He had a lot of friends, and so we had more support there than we probably would have if we had retreated back to her family home in Oregon or his family home in Ohio.
Yeah. Does your mom still miss the reservation? I mean, is that
in
something?
some ways? And I have an adopted sister who is Lakota. She has since died, but I've got nieces and nephews on the res still. And this was before they changed the law so you couldn't adopt. But yeah, so yeah, I have family members there still, and so yeah.
Do you have an opportunity to see them, or?
Not physically, but we Skype, we do the Facebook thing, and we talk a fair amount. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. One other question I want to ask you, because I think we want to connect this a little bit to our current situation or scenario, right? Even though
we went down a rabbit hole, didn't we?
Exhausted about that. No, that's okay. No, it's pure delight to talk with you every time we get to talk. To be honest, I always learn something.
None of it true.
No,
but it sounds good, right?
We do fact check after these conversations. I've got it all written down. I'm going to fact check. But the curious thing is how. You had mentioned before we started about the Navajo community and how it's being impacted by COVID and Flagstaff, and explain a little bit about that from your perspective, why potentially it has such an impact in the Navajo reservation.
Yeah. My first job in Arizona was up in Page, Arizona, which is this tiny outpost where they stole it from the Navajo reservation in order to build the Glen Canyon Dam, but it's completely surrounded by reservation.
Yeah.
And so there's one community hospital and a couple of clinics there, and largely serving employees of the Glen Canyon Dam and also off the reservation. But they do very little. They don't have a level 1 trauma center. They don't have anything to handle anything major. And then the surrounding hospitals, you've got a little clinic in Kayenta and then a IHS hospital in Tuba City. But then you've got people all off in their raising sheep and doing whatever out on the reservation, living in either a single-wide trailer or a hogan, and they don't have water other than what they can haul in their pickup trucks. And so you could have 10, 12 people living in a single-wide trailer, and the only water they have is what they can haul once a week from Page or Tuba City, and you have that many people living that close together and no means of having reasonable hygiene. You're not going to be able to control a virus, I saw that even just with colds and flus and things like that on the reservation. And now that you get coronavirus coming in, and there is no golden hour, there is no definitive level of health care. So you get this huge geographical area with a large population, and their only source to go for any definitive level of care is Flagstaff. So most of the people with COVID in Flagstaff Medical Center are off the reservation.
So is that, what were you doing in Page? Was that at the community hospital there? It wasn't
Yeah,
a VA,
I
right?
worked at a clinic there. I was still doing family medicine there. And, you know, and the other thing is too, think about historically what happened when white men came to the
Yes.
reservation.
Right.
We are the descendants of people who survived the bubonic plague. And so there's a certain amount of immunity that comes from that. And so we come to a population, Europeans come to a culture that has been isolated on this landmass, and we bring pathogens to them that they have no native immunity to. And so, you know, things that Europeans have developed an immunity to over the centuries, they hit Lakota, they hit all the Native Americans with a vengeance and just decimated their population. And so the other thing that I think is happening, and this is just me spitballing just with epidemiology stuff, is that we've got viruses that have come over that are hitting a fairly insular, fairly isolated group of people who've passed through a genetic bottleneck, and so they don't have any natural immunity to it. And so you've got this lack of immunity, plus the lack of exposure to definitive medical care, plus lack of hygiene, lack of ability to distance. You've got all of these things creating this significant risk.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Plus the fact that most of them don't have money to pay for health care.
Right. Yep.
And they're going to wait longer, and they're going to be sicker longer before they finally go in and get health care.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. That reminds me that we need to be really thinking, praying, right? Doing more than thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, a little bit more than thoughts
But
and prayers.
acting,
Yeah.
and finding ways to really, I don't want to say fix that, right? But deal with that situation in our healthcare.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So a couple of just final thoughts from you. Is there anything you want to share with the community as we're taping this evening around 6 o'clock? Anything you'd like to share or reflect on?
I think it's just more philosophy of life itself. This whole idea that we're going to be this American illusion, this middle-class white American illusion that we can make life safe.
Well, that's not an illusion.
It's bullshit, is
I
what
know,
it is.
it is.
Life is inherently unsafe.
Yeah.
And none of us are getting off this planet alive. And I guess the only way I can live my life and keep sane is to accept that. As the Army would say, embrace the suck, as they would say on the Lakota reservation, of Hokahe, which is a good day to die. Because it isn't until you embrace death and you embrace your own mortality and the imminent reality of the fact that you're gonna die and that's okay, that you can really start living your life.
You're right.
And that doesn't mean you're gonna be stupid.
Yeah.
But I have a hard time with people who've been shelters all of their lives, who the coronavirus is their very first time in their life where they've had to worry about dying. You know? And that seems strange to me. Because I grew up with the imminent threat of death on a regular basis, you know, just growing up. And so this whole idea that we can even be safe or have an expectation of safety just kind of blows my mind. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's this, you know, I think the comment that I hear many people make, and is, when is it going to get back to normal? Well, normal is this consumer, close your eyes, right? And live for all the future, not for the moment. Look out, what's ahead, you know, making sure we pad our 401ks and realize that life is really a temporary condition and it's a gift, and use it and spend it wisely, you know. And I think you're right. When you embrace death is when you begin to live. And I found even during this time that I feel like I'm living more fully than I was before, because all of this is saying to me, embrace the moment, embrace your life, see what's good, see what's beautiful. Even the fact that there was a bird that flew right in between us here,
Right.
you know, I don't know if that would have happened a few weeks ago,
Right.
because I think creation's starting to take it back, right? The birds of the air, and we have dolphins in the canals in Venice. And so there's a beauty to that, right? And that there's a cycle of life and cycle of death. And that's very much a part of the indigenous community. So.
You know, and it's interesting too, this idea that this whole dominion concept, which I reject, and it's, you know, from the viewpoint of a deer, the wolf is Satan.
Yeah, yeah.
From the viewpoint of the wolf, the deer is God providing for her cubs. I studied ecology in college too, and it's always difficult for me in medicine because we tend to think on the micro level. I tend to think about my relationship with the person sitting across from me and how I can better their life and give them the skill set to better their own lives. But when you look at the grand scheme of things and look at the fact that we've got nearly 8 billion people on this planet, on a planet that really only has the ability to support less than half of those for any length of time, you look at humans in the same sense as we would see the virus, where we are an affliction on this planet. And so when you look at it with the Lakota mindset, the God concept, where none of us are any more important than anybody else, the very fact that humans have exceeded the carrying capacity, and humans through our lifetime of bad decisions have created this problem, and that this is a point where God, nature, whatever you want to call it, is trying to restore the balance. And that's a dangerous thing for me to say as a medical person, because I could get crucified for saying that. But the fact of the matter is, what we are doing in modern medicine is actively anti-evolutionary. You know, it's not a good thing we do. On the micro level, it's a good thing. And as humans, it's a good thing. But when you look at the world as a whole, it's a bad thing.
Yeah, right. And even as a clergy person, that would not be, you know, because I think as clergy, traditionally, church elevates human and elevates humanity and devalues the world and the creation around us, which is abhorrent, right? It's terrible. And it's really about valuing everything. And I think it's really interesting because I've had some people tell me, and I don't even know the truth of this or not, I haven't quite Googled it well enough, but you know that there's some animals now that are, that they found that have COVID. And that's fascinating that if actually the animals caught it from us, right, are now catching it from us or what have you. But I think about that this is a time, like to say actually that this is a time that creation is healing. Creation is finding its space, is taking it back, is certainly not something, that's something that goes against traditional Christian understanding of dominion, which of course I don't believe and you don't believe. But I think there's a beauty in that, right? Yeah. There's a beauty in that.
There's a beauty in embracing our mortality. It's a beauty in realizing we are not top dog. And that something as small as a virus can take us out. And I think we need to learn that humility.
Yeah. So maybe that's a part of this journey, right?
Yeah.
Then whenever in the next few weeks things go back to the way they were, that we remember that, that we live differently, that we embrace our mortality, and something as small as a little virus has the whole world shut down.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. If you go back to the whole Adam and Eve thing in the Garden of Eden, where they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life. You know, but we never, because we're still finite creatures, we are never truly gonna understand good and evil in the sense that God does, because God or the totality or the entire universe is bigger than any one human's intellect.
Correct.
And this idea that we can have control over life and death, it's only an idea. It's not real. We don't actually have control over life and death. We just think we do.
Right.
And so I think that's the principal hubris of humans, that we think we have control over life and death, and we think that we are God.
And we look at those in the medical profession, doctors,
Yeah.
nurses,
Mhm.
scientists, researchers, right? And we think they're
Mhm.
God. They're the ones keeping us alive.
Right.
They're the ones finding cures. When
Right.
in essence,
Well, the joke I tell my patients
God's still
periodically. The joke I tell my patients periodically is, do you know the difference between God and a doctor? God doesn't think he's a doctor.
that's great.
That might be a good way to end it. I
That
don't
might
know.
be a good way to end it. Gosh. Well, I really appreciate your insights, and I'm hoping that we've given you folks some really good ideas, good thoughts to chew on, to take into your life in a very, very personal way. And when we're all back together again, feel free to to pick Max's brain, right?
Well, I've
during
always-
coffee hour or any other time.
I've always said that if you can't be a good example, at least be a cautionary tale. So
That's great. So thank you, Max, for your time
Thanks,
and your
Nick.
energy.
It's been
And
fun.
thank you. We honor you for what you do in the health profession, and are just really grateful for you and for your family. So be well, be safe. Peace.